Alright, today we're going to show you how to replace the front brake pads and rotors on a 2010 Mitsubishi Lancer ES. Now we have the tools that you're going to need in front of you here, starting from left to right. You're going to need a 1/2-inch breaker bar. You're going to want some brake parts lubricant, some Antisieze. You'll need your 1/2-inch torque wrench, a 17mm and 14mm. We have our 3/8 electric impact to make some of our job's a little faster when we're removing some of the bolts and nuts after we've broken them loose. So we have the associated 3/8, 14mm and 17mm to go with that. And then just a thin 3/8 and 1/4 inch just to make it a little easier, as well as 2 flathead screwdrivers and a caliper piston press. But if you don't have that tool, which is this guy right here, you can also use these guys, which are just your big vice grip pliers to pull it through. And then last, we use our wire brush so that we can clean the face where the rotor sits on the spindle. The thing we'll do is remove the wheel and tire. Typically you'll have your wheel and tire straight, but I have this at an angle to give you guys a better view. And we'll just roll that out of the way. And I like to keep a drain pan here to keep all the rust and stuff that we're going to knock off here in a confined space and not all over the driveway. So next thing we'll do is I'm going to move the camera and you'll be looking at the 14mm bolts on the back of the caliper. Alright, so before we start to undo anything, I like to take a flathead screwdriver and pry the caliper back, and what that does is it compresses the piston. The piston's located in this housing right here, and when that piston compresses, it makes it a lot easier for us to do this job. And I'll show you why in a second. So I do it slowly, you don't want to do it too fast. And once this is fully compressed, we'll be able to easily remove this. So next I have my 14mm and I have it on a 1/2-inch breaker. Just going to move this hose out of the way. All you do is you just press this hose right out of the way. It's on a little bracket and has a little grommet. With that out of the way, put my 14mm on my top caliper slide pin. I'm just going to loosen it up. And now I'm going to loosen my lower before I remove the upper. Now I'm going to put these caliper slide pins on a rag so that I don't get any debris on them. And the next thing is to take a bungee cord and put the bungee cord through the strut spring and then hang the caliper, because you don't want to have any excessive weight on this caliper hose, because this brake hose is not intended to hold the weight of this caliper. So grab this guy and hook it out of the way. Now just to talk about compressing this piston, that's what I did when I put that screwdriver through this hole and pressed against the rotor and the pads. And what that does is it just pries and pushes against this piston and sits it back in, so that it makes it a lot easier when we install our new pads. So with this out of the way, we'll go back to the caliper bracket. Now I'm using my breaker bar and a 17mm to remove the caliper bracket bolts. And I break both of them loose before I remove either of them. Realizing that that was a pretty poor angle because my elbow was in the way, your caliper mounting bracket goes to this location here and this location here on either side of this axle. You'll see this is your axle, your CV joint, and then they're on the upper and the lower. And I'm going to go ahead and take a picture of that from the back side so you guys can get a better. Now with a big hammer, we're going to go ahead and just remove this rotor. So we're going to go ahead and clean the face of this spindle right here, because that's what was keeping this rotor on, was that the rotor and this face here had rusted together. So I'm just going to use some brake parts cleaner to kind of knock off the loose stuff, and then I'll come in here with a wire brush and just clean it off. The next thing I'll do is take a little bit of Antisieze, and I'll just barely dab a little bit on my finger. So I'll show you how much I'm doing. Just a little dab. Little dab. And then I'm just going to blot it around this face here. And now I'm going to just smear it all around. And there's not a lot here. It goes a really long way. And the reason I'm doing this is if you are going to do any other sort of suspension work, or let's say for another repair, like removing the axle, you're going to go ahead and remove the rotor and caliper assembly because it's easier for you that way. You don't want to have to hammer the rotor like I did to remove it, because then it's damaged and it's not going to wear properly and you're going to have a brake pulsation. So this is why I like to put some Antisieze on there, so that we don't have any sort of rust forming, and we just put that small film, and it makes our lives a lot easier down the road. The next thing we'll do is we'll just go ahead and place our new rotor on. You're going to grab your brake caliper mount, and you're going to remove the old brake pads. And then you're going to remove your anti-rattle clips. And then you're just going to clean the surface rust off where they were sitting. And then I just use a little bit of brake parts cleaner and just douse them off. Now I'm not getting any brake parts cleaner inside of these grommets because these are where your slide pins live, and we're actually going to end up re-greasing these. So with that cleaned off and drying out, you'll take your new anti-rattle clips and you'll just pop them on. And they just go on like so. So this is the top, this is the bottom, and then this little notch here slips into this notch there. And then you have these two tabs here which hold it centered. So, show that up to the camera and you can see how those go on. Now I like to take a little bit of the ceramic brake parts lubricant, and I'm just taking a little tiny bit, that's just a little dab, way smaller than what we put on this rotor. And I just put a small little dab of lubricant on the inside of these anti-rattle clips to kind of give the pads the ability to move around as they set themselves in. And it's just a small smear. There's nothing really to it, just a little smear of it. And now I grab my pads, and I'm going to start with the most inner pad, because the most inner pad is supposed to have this small clip on it. Now if you're having a bunch of trouble getting this clip on, it's not the end of the world. Don't fret about it. But if you have the ability to clip this on, it goes on the bottom portion of this pad in one of the corners, and you'll see that it has a little rectangle stamped out, and then there's a small edge that's been chopped down, and that's supposed to allow you to easily clip this on. Sometimes these give me a lot of headache, like this one is. But you just keep pressing it on, give a little bit of a wiggle, and if it doesn't come off, then you're probably good. So now we're going to go ahead and slide this in. Now the more important thing when you're sliding these in is making sure that they very smoothly go in and out inside of their anti-rattle clips, because if they don't, that means that you either have too much rust on the back side of this anti-rattle clip, or the manufacturing of your pad was incorrect. And if that is the case, what you'll do is you'll just take an angle grinder and you'll just chop off a little tiny bit, like 1/1000th of an inch, off the end of either of these two, and that'll give your pad a much nicer, easier time moving in and out. So we'll just go ahead and put this other one back on. And now these are ready to go back on. So I have my 2 bolts that hold on the caliper bracket, and I just put a little dab, not a lot, just a little dab of blue Loctite. and that keeps it from rattling out when you have all the road vibrations. This is not a necessary step, but this is a solid step to do to ensure that you don't have any comebacks. So I'll go ahead and slip this over the rotor, and I'm going to start with the bottom one. You can do either one, but I'm just starting with the bottom. Alright. Now I'm just going to place those bolts the rest of the way in. And now with my torque wrench, I'm going to torque these down. On this top one, I'm going to need to use an extension in order to fit my torque wrench in there. And I'm going to torque this in. Now if you don't have a torque wrench and you're nervous about this, you can probably go down to your local auto parts store and rent one. So now it's time to put the caliper back on. And what I'll do is grab my caliper slide pins, and I'm just going to dip them lightly in this brake caliper, this brake parts grease that I have. And I don't put a whole lot on it because it really goes a long way. And I'll unhook my caliper, make sure that my hose is in the correct orientation, and slide it on. Now what you're seeing here is that this piston's not all the way seated, and it's causing some drama. It's causing some drama, not letting me get this guy back together. So the quick and easy way is to take a real big set of pliers and grab it and pinch it closed. Now that that's fully seated, what I do here is I just chase this little seal. This is a piston seal on the caliper. Here's your piston. That's the seal, and I just chase it around and I tuck it back in so that it doesn't pinch and tear when you put your new pads on. So I'm just going around and tucking it back in. Sometimes they've ballooned out on you and they won't. Like this one's ballooned out a little bit and it's not going to sneak back in for us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully move this out of the way and place it back on. Once that's seated, we'll take the caliper slide pins, and I'll just put the bottom one in. Grab the top one, I'll put the top one in. And then I'll put just a little dab of blue Loctite on the most inner threads. And then I'll start tightening them down. And these are just torqued to about 28 to 30 foot-pounds. I'll put the actual foot-pound range from Identifix in the description. But these don't need to be put on incredibly tight. So there you have it. If you've come this far and you wanted to bleed your brakes, you'll see that you have your brake bleeding nipple right here. That's your fitting, and that's an 8mm. You would just remove this cover and hook up your brake bleeding tool and get at it. We're going to go just double check, make sure that all of our bolts are tight, these 4 right here, and then we'll grab our hose and put it back into its little metal hanger and rubber grommet. We'll then take out this oil pan and we'll put the wheel and tire back on. And with our wheel and tire on the ground, we'll go ahead and torque our lug nuts.